Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Kristen Balasia, Head of Automotive Advisory at IHS Markit. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues Mike Wall, Executive Director of Automotive Analysis, and Phil Amsrud, Senior Analyst, Semiconductors and Components. We're going to be taking a look at how 2021 is coming to an end, and then looking to 2022 and asking the question everyone's asking, is this the year of recovery or one of continued disruption? I read somewhere the other day that said, I wonder if year 3 of COVID is going to be my favorite year. So we'll see what we think 2022 is going to look like and if we can really call this a recovery year. But before we do that, Mike, why don't we start by taking a look at what we can expect for the full year as we wrap up 2021?
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. It's interesting. It's been a bit of a mixed bag as we're closing the year out. Believe it or not, we do have a couple markets that are coming in a little stronger with fourth quarter production, and specifically Greater China and South Asia, which is great. All told, though, boy, when you think about, when we've had prior conversations, maybe as we wrapped up last year, thinking about broader recovery in 2021, obviously the fates have intervened and things turned out quite a bit different because of the supply chain pressures. But so overall, at the end of the day, we're looking at global light vehicle production about 75.5 million units for this year. Far cry from pre-COVID levels, but still up about 1.2% year over year versus last year. It's interesting when you think about it from a sales perspective. In most markets, inventory is so lean that even though we've had some maybe some outperformance in some regions from a production standpoint as we close out the year, I don't know that we're going to see a lot of bows on the top of vehicles at dealerships at the end of this year. The inventory is going to be very tight for some time.
Absolutely. And the other topic everyone is very interested in is the ongoing semiconductor shortage. Phil, how much of a concern are semiconductors going to be in 2022 and for how long?
Well, 2022 is not going to be a return back to normal, 2017 types of performance. What it's going to be is better than it was this year. And I say that from the perspective of this year, certainly in the first half of the year, there was just a lot of unknowns in the supply chain. Hey, can I get 100 of these? I don't know. When can I get them? I don't know. I think what 2022 is going to look like in that same situation is going to be a lot more. I need 100. You can get 80. When can I get them? You can get them in 32 weeks. It's still not going to be typical. It's not going to be 100% to expectations, both in quantities or timing. But it's going to be more predictable than it was in 2021. And I think we've already started to see some of that. And I think that's also helped some of the transients that we've gone through this year settle out, where people have now settled in that this is going to be more of a multi-year event that we're going through, as opposed to a typical allocation event that's over within 3-4 quarters. So we're seeing that this is definitely going to extend into 2022. The second half of 22 will be better than the first half of 22. There's also the possibility this could even bleed in a little into 23. But at this point, that's a pretty fuzzy crystal ball that we've got going out that far. But we're not going to get back to normal anytime in calendar year 2022.
So talking about 2022, Mike, I wonder how, based on our forecasts, how is 2022 overall going to compare to 21 or even 20?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Everybody's very much focused on it. And we hear from Phil, you hear that air of caution in his voice. Bear in mind that is partially, or maybe more than partially, really informing our forecast, because obviously we need these components in order to build vehicles. Now, the good news is 2022 will look better than 2021. That's the first takeaway. But again, owing to kind of Phil's observations, it's a gradual. This is going to be a process. This is going to still be something of a transitional year. When we look at global production as an example, I mentioned 2021 being around 1.2% growth. When you look at 2022, we're looking at about 9% growth. And amongst the major markets, Greater China growth by about 1.6%. North America, and bear in mind, we've had 2 full years now of roughly 13 million units of production in North America. Not great numbers by any stretch of the imagination. But looking out to 2022, we're looking at about 15.2 million units, roughly 17.2% growth. Now, that's the good news. Glass half full, glass half empty is, boy, we should be probably closer to 17 million units plus. You look at the ever important European market this year, down about 5.4% in terms of production. Next year, we are projecting growth of about 18%. So it is going to be a deliberate kind of growth, but it is measured. And again, following a fairly similar glide path as Phil's kind of mentioning in terms of really being followed by how the supply chain evolves throughout the year.
Phil, when we talk about semiconductors and you talked about the timing and when we think we may come out of this, concerns still exist across the semiconductor space. And what do you look at, auto, non-auto, global demand and supply, to consider when looking for signs of that recovery versus continued disruption?
You know, there's a lot of factors that are getting looked at, and quite honestly, this is the first time I've been in a situation that has been of this nature. So we're looking at things that we probably never looked at before. So, you know, the typical supply and demand things are out there. You know, how does auto track against non-auto demand and capacities out there? But one of the other things that that we've started to look at, and this isn't anything that we report, it's something that we just internally digest, is the equipment lead times for back end and front end. And though lead times for new equipment has pushed out dramatically, and in some cases, what is typically a 3 to 6 month lead time to get new equipment now is 12 to 18 months. So for all the news that we hear about investment in new fab capacity, that's great. We need capacity. I think one of the things that we've realized this year was just how close we were to the razor's edge in terms of overall semiconductor capacity. Now, there's a mix issue in there. It's not, you know, not all capacity is the same, but beyond that, there was this sudden uptick in announcements this year in terms of investments to put in additional capacity. And what we're finding now is, you know, those things still take time. And even if you had the equipment today, it would take you months to be able to get an automotive line qualified. But now you have to add to that, it may take you a year to get the equipment. So those are some of the things that we're looking at in addition to just trying to track better, you know, how the supply demand inside, outside of automotive line up.
So more broadly, also, I even shudder a little bit to ask this question, Phil or Mike, what do you see as the next potential industry pinch point? As we have so much focus on semiconductors, we're working on the investments and, you know, expediting everything possible and substituting and doing everything that we can from an engineering perspective. What's next? What are we going to be talking about next?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's always a tough one to predict too. But you know, that's partly part of our business, of course. So as we're kind of canvassing sources out there and clients and contacts, you know, certainly mindful of the fact that we're not fully out of COVID on the one hand and not out of the semiconductor situation. You know, we're seeing some pressure in an area it's called electrical steel. Think of it as it's a special alloy, steel alloy that's used in more magnetic properties. And as we can imagine with electric vehicles, what's featured in electric vehicles, of course, electric motors. There's a lot of applications for electric steel there. And what we see, and of course, there's also industrial applications and the like. So with the increased usage of this electrical steel in the automotive sector, it does look like there could be some pressure on supply and availability for that core component. We look at labor. You know, labor is a recurring theme when we talk to suppliers out there, manufacturers of all types, at the labor pressures. The other thing we'll be watching closely is, you know, the hope is that we start to see that production recovery start to inflect upward. Then the next question is, how are suppliers able to navigate that and manage that? What's the stress test level, you know, to be able to flex up, if you will, their operations back up? The hope is, and I think that, you know, certainly the desire will be there, but will the resources, whether it be labor, raw materials, all of that and the like, it's going to make for, you know, again, an interesting ramp and an interesting growth phase and recovery pace as we get there.
So you talk about materials and components and supply chain issues, but maybe conspicuous by its absence, you didn't mention COVID. So how will the Omicron variant impact the situation in 2022?
Yeah, it's interesting. As we look at it, and it's early yet, early days to be sure, and we don't have it fully factored in. Certainly we're looking at it very closely, but because it is so early, it's tough to make a call one way or the other, or go too deep with significant assumption sets, because we're seeing in a wide variety of themes coming out of this. It looks like it is. Looks like the outcomes with this variant are potentially not as negative, not as dire as Delta, and we're mindful of the fact that the vast majority of the cases right now are Delta. They're the Delta variant. So we're still in the midst of Delta. Omicron is still very early days, and it does look like it is well controlled by vaccines, and those outcomes are still seemingly well managed, at least thus far. And again, we knock on wood that holds pat. We're still going to have to. Now, we're also mindful of the fact, too, that Delta itself has ravaged the supply chain. And obviously, it's been terrible for the broader populace, but it has had massive impacts, especially within the semiconductor supply chain as well. So we're not taking it lightly, but by the same token, it is a little bit early to make any broader calls, at least at this point.
All right, so one more question for you, Mike, and I'm going to give you a chance to talk about something that's maybe a little bit more optimistic. What about the investments and upsides? We talk about all the headwinds, right? Maybe let's talk a little bit about some of the tailwinds. It's not all shortages and COVID. I mean, if you listen to what a lot of the industry is saying about the electrification and software and services. I mean, GM alone is saying they plan to drive 25 billion in revenue by 2030 in software and subscription services, and Stellantis not far behind at 23 billion. Maybe what are some of those areas of growth that we should be excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm old enough to remember when billions used to mean a lot with a lot of money, but everybody's talking billions these days. And that's the exciting part about the auto industry. I mean, you're right. There's a lot of pressure and sort of there's a negative connotation, obviously, around the supply chain pressures that we have. But there's a huge positive story out there with a lot of opportunity within this industry. And it's not just in kind of old school, Rust Belt kind of technology, or however you want to caveat it. It's some of the highest tech out there. In fact, you listen to automakers, they don't really talk about manufacturing vehicles all that much. It's talking about software as a service. It's talking about subscription services and using that technology. And of course, the electrification of the vehicle, battery technology, vertical integration within the automotive sector to bring in power electronics and batteries as well. So it does run the gamut, and there's some significant opportunities out there. We're only scratching the surface of it too. That's the beauty of it for the auto industry writ large. And when you look at suppliers out there, and certainly automakers, there is a lot more untapped opportunity out there.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about the little bit about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and as you mentioned, what we can learn and maybe what can we do differently. And so, Phil, given what the industry's gone through in 2021, and I would say prior to that, are there some things that will be done differently beyond even 2022?
Yeah, I think we started seeing the indications of this right at the beginning of this year when things were just starting to look a little uneasy. And I think some of those things, to point them out now seems trivial, but I think the whole auto industry has now realized the importance of semiconductors. And I think even beyond that, there's a much greater appreciation now for the strategic value of semiconductors that the automakers have. And I think the issues that they've gone through earlier this year with MCU availability caused them to rethink the reliance that they've had for the past several decades on relatively mature process nodes with relatively mature MCU architectures. That was something they'd become very comfortable with. And I think this year really shook them almost to the foundation in terms of, hey, can you be too comfortable with some of those things? And now, I mean, it's in the last couple of weeks, we've seen announcements between GM, Ford, Stellantis, BMW, with Global Foundries, with TSMC, with the various semiconductor suppliers. I think those are some of the first signs that the auto industry has really taken to heart that they really need to almost rethink this from the ground up. The good news is we're at an inflection point, like Mike talked about, with electrification and autonomy and all the other new services and features going on the car that leverage semiconductors. Give me 5 years to look back on this and say, was this a perfect storm and everything went wrong, or was this a perfect storm that it really created all these green shoot opportunities for semiconductors to be rethought in cars, and now we're going to push forward with new vehicle architectures based on more advanced process nodes than automotive would have gotten there naturally with. So I think there's a lot of opportunities between the relationships from the OEMs, the tier ones, into the supply chain, but also in terms of just how semiconductors are used strategically by the automakers in new, novel, interesting architectures to really leverage what we've all been told about for years was coming, with self-driving cars are just around the corner. Well, some of that's going to require some of these new architectures, and now we're at an inflection point where, if you're going to make changes, this might be the year to do it.
Right. And when you look at the number of EVs coming out, some of these new vehicles can have up to, 3 times the number of semiconductors as the vehicles on the road now. I think you're right, Phil. This could be an opportunity for the industry really to take a hard look at how they're designing these things, how interchangeable they are, how reliant they are on certain things, and broad-based awareness. I mean, I feel like we learn every decade or so something happens that the industry didn't see coming, and takes us a while to react and respond to, and not that those things won't happen again, but we learn something from every single incident, and I think that's the important part about our industry and the time that we're living through right now. So Mike, maybe to wrap up, that's a good segue into normal before the next crisis comes up, which inevitably happen. Hopefully it is another decade before that happens. What will a return to normal look like for automakers, suppliers, dealers, really the whole chain?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I'm mindful of the fact, normal is going to look a little different, and a lot of times it's cliche to say, well, this time will be different, and we end up reverting to our old ways. I don't think that's going to be the case this time around. I think normal will look a little different. I think for automakers, there is going to be, I think, a stronger push to really understand your full supply chain, tier 2, tier 3, and down. We've learned a lot of lessons over the years, going back, 2011 with the Fukushima earthquake. But by the same token, this was a clear case of where we really need to have a better understanding of that full supply chain. Also carrying maybe less inventory. I think automakers and dealers alike have seen the value in that, dropping down to the bottom line, to be sure. Also bolstering the build to order, process, and that sort of thing, in the ordering process for automakers, and the dealers working within there as well. Great opportunities can be had there, and that speaks to Phil's observation. I mean, there are some great lessons learned that we can take away with us on that. For suppliers, it's going to be interesting. Opportunities do abound on the electrified vehicle front, to be sure. So that is going to be something that suppliers can certainly grab onto. Again, we're going to be in for a bit more production volatility over this next year, but better volumes. That should bode well for suppliers. But by the same token, they also have to be keeping their eye on the horizon, and this again ongoing shift towards electrification, and figuring out where they're going to fall within that new landscape is going to be critical.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both, Mike and Phil. Always interesting and insightful. A lot to consider. With that, we'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt into our newsletter that provides more information on these topics and many others, please visit ihsmarket.com/auto newsletter.